Hello and welcome to the Robots and Pencils Academy. I'm your host, Jonathan Rasmussen. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at NSUserDefaults. NSUserDefaults are handy because as we select controls in our iPhone application, sometimes we want to be able to save them. So when we navigate away and come back, we remember where they were. In this episode, we're going to look at how to use NSUserDefaults and persist the state of these controls. All right, so let's create a new single view application. We're going to call this NSUserDefaults, and I'm going to call it NSUserDefaults 2 because this is the second time I've done this morning. And feel free to save that wherever you like. And once this opens up, go ahead and let's click on our storyboard. And first, let's draw the views for what we're going to be controlling. Now you'll see here, this is an iOS 6 view controller that comes up. For those of you who have been used to 4 and 5, you can see that this is a little bit longer. Just because I like the real estate a little bit more of 4, I'm just going to hit this button down here just to shrink it. That's something I just discovered with the latest version of Xcode. So you can reduce the size or play with the iOS version 5 screen if you like by hitting that control there. Anyways, what we want is a view controller, and on it we're going to add the following elements. Let's start with a date picker. So I'm just going to drag a date picker out here. I also would like to have a switch. So I'm going to drag a switch out here, put you about there. And then just to show you what it's like to actually set text on a label, I'm also going to put a label in there. We're not going to dynamically be altering this label. It's going to be hard-coded, but I just want you to see how to set the text using NSUserDefaults. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and add some code to this. I'm just going to expand my real estate here to give me a little bit more room. I'm going to hit the assistant editor, and what I'd like to do here is just have a little bit more, I want to create controls for these things so I can interact with them when we actually go to grab their current state and then set it back. So I'm just going to control drag over each of these controls here. I'm going to call this guy my switch, and I like the type that says UI switch there. I'm going to keep that. I'll also then grab this label. So I'm going to hold down the control key. Whoops, I don't want that yellow highlighting. Hold down the control key and drag over our label. I'll call that my label. And I like the fact it's a UI label. And I'll do the same for the date picker. Control drag over our date picker. And I'll call this my date picker. And there we've got some properties for our controls here. Now while I'm in here, I'm just going to drop some properties. Sorry, not properties. These are some constants. These are the keys that we're going to use to store the values of these properties in our NSUserDefaults storage. So you'll see how we're going to use these in a second. I'm just going to define them up here. Now next, I'd like to set up some action for these guys. I'd like to know when someone switches our switch or picks one of our dates. So I'm just going to come over here and flip over to our viewController.m, the implementation. I'm just going to get rid of these two methods. We don't need view.did.load or did.receive.memory.warning. And I'm going to click on the switch and just control drag that action over here and create a new insert action. And I'm going to call this switch toggled. And I want to make sure my type is UI switch. So if yours says ID, change it to UI switch. Otherwise, we'll have to cast the ID to a UI switch in order to get anything interesting out of it. And likewise, we're going to do the same thing for the date picker. I'm just going to control drag that guy out here. I'm going to create an action called date picked. And again, I want to make sure my ID says UI date picker, so I'll make sure that's selected. I'll click connect. And there we have two actions ready to go to support capturing anyone toggling the state of our switch or our date picker. For our switch, I'm just going to do something like this. I'm going to capture the state of that switch in a Boolean called on/off, and then I'm just going to print out the value of the switch, whether it is on, whether it is off, depending upon the state of that Boolean. Likewise, down here, I'm going to do something similar for our date picker. I'm going to get the date from our sender and then just print out the date that was picked. Okay, let's run these and see if we've got these things hooked up. Okay, so here's my switch. If I turn it off, good. I can see from my output it detected that I turned it off. If I turn it on, it's on. Let's go down to our date picker here. Ah, good. As I click through the dates here, it's just printing out different dates that I'm selecting from the picker. I'm going to go to August 1st. I'm going to leave that switch off. Now watch what happens if we stop running the application, and then I'm going to go Command R to run it again. Notice how our date picker and our switch went back to their default values? That's because we're not saving their state, and that's what NSUserDefaults is going to do for us. It's going to remember or save the dates that we pick here and remember the state of our switches. So let's look at how we can hook that up next. We're going to make use of NSUserDefaults through the view controller lifecycle. Basically, every time the view is about to appear, we're going to load any user defaults that we've got saved. And likewise, if the view is going to disappear, we're going to save the state of these controls into our NSUserDefaults so we can load them up later. Now I'm just going to plunk down the code for the loading and the saving of the NSUserDefaults, and then we'll walk through it together. All right, let's start with save. So save is going to be called when our view is about to disappear. So when our view controller is about to go off screen, we're going to call save user defaults, and this is where the user defaults code really comes in. What we do is we get a standard user default library or instance of the object. This is the thing that we're going to use to persist the state of our objects to disk and then read back later. And it's on these defaults that we can do all sorts of really neat things. For instance, we could save the value of a label. In this case, I'm just going to, this label over here, which currently has no value, I'm going to put the word saved in there. And then we're going to read that back later. Likewise, if we want to save a Boolean value, for instance, the value of my switch, we can also save that for a given key. So here's where our keys come into play. All that we do is we take objects and store them for given keys. So in this case, the label for the label key, our switch for our switch key, and then my date picker, that date, which we're going to save as an object, for the date picker key. Then once we've set all the objects into our defaults, it's this line here which actually saves them to disks. Default synchronize. Once we do that, we've saved the state of those controllers to disk. Now when our view will appear, we're going to do the exact opposite. We're going to get our defaults object, but now we're going to get the state of what we saved earlier. So here we're going to set the label to be the string that we stored according to the myLabel key. We're going to get the switch and set that depending upon the value of the Boolean for the switch key. And for date, I just did one date check here because if the first time we run it, we won't have a date object there, so it might error on us. That's why I've got this if save date. But once we do have a date, I can set the date on my date picker by again just reading out the default object for key, this time using the date picker key. Now there is one gotcha before we run this. Right now, view will disappear is never going to get called. And that's because we never get rid of the view. In order to make this method be called, I need to transition to another view controller and then come back to this one. So in order to do that, I'm just going to embed this view controller in a navbar controller so I can transition away and then come back. All right, let's see what that looks like. Okay, so let's quickly embed this guy in a navbar controller. First, I'm going to select the view controller, editor, embed in, navigation controller. I'm going to give this guy a title. I'll just call him home for now. I'm going to drag up a bar button item just to have somewhere to segue to. I'm just going to drop that in the upper right hand corner here. I'm going to call that move. Then I'm going to hit Control A just to select all of those and drag those guys over here. Because what I'd really like to do is to come back over here and drag out another view controller, one that I can segue to. So I'm going to plunk him there, select this bar button item, Control drag over, accept the push segue. Bingo, there we go. Let's just align this guy to make him look nice. Let's give this guy a title like move. And there you have it. We've got a view controller we can segue to and then come back to this one and hopefully see the value of these controls be persisted and then put back. Okay, now let's run this and see what happens. Okay, there we can see load user defaults was run when we first came in. I'm going to turn this, let's turn this off. And let's go to another date. Let's go to September 7th. Let's move away now. There, save user defaults was called. Thank you very much. We'll come back to home. And there we go. Our dates are being saved. Let's go all the way to October 1st. And let's, with this on, let's move away, come back, and it's still on, and it's still October 1st. Excellent. So there you have it. That's all there is to using NSUserDefaults. Basically, we just get the standard default library, set some values, and then read them back later. This is a really handy quick control just to save really nice little affordances, make it very easy to save some client data, and just a really convenient, simple way to save some data, persist it, and then bring it back later. Well, that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Take care, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.